Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Sagacity. Today I have with me Brooke Travis from Harvard University. Her PhD is in organismic and evolutionary biology. Hi Brooke, welcome to Sagacity. How are you today?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Tell us what organismic and evolutionary biology is and what your specific research focus is.
Yeah. So the official name of my PhD encompasses a lot. Organismic level, behavioral studies, molecular studies, everything that relates to an organism and a physiological aspect. The evolutionary component is our department wide has this interest in the evolutionary context of these organisms and the relation and their significance to Earth and time. But my interests under this giant umbrella lie in deep ocean biology. So I'm actually a marine biologist, and in my program, I study symbiotic relationships in the deep sea. So it gets very niche in my own personal topic, but this umbrella topic kind of covers this interest of mine.
Tell us a little bit about what symbiotic relationships are in lay terms, so people in our audience who might not be familiar with the term can also understand what your specific research area is focusing on.
Yeah, so symbiotic relationships means that two organisms are living together in close proximity, and they're usually sharing a benefit by doing this. So you can think about it as like the bacteria in your gut, right? They actually live within you, and that type of symbiosis is called endosymbiosis, which is also what I study. And they gain the benefit of living within you because you provide a home for them, right? And in return, they help you digest certain materials. So it's this relationship where both species benefit from being in close proximity to each other.
Why is this research important? Why should people care about what you do?
Yeah. So I think to explain why it's important, I'll have to explain it in a bit more detail. So I study a particular type of symbiotic relationship. It's called chemoautotrophic symbiosis. And that's a big word, but to help us understand what that means, I'll draw from an example we're probably more familiar with, which is photosynthesis, right? So plants around us and some other organisms will harness the energy of light to make their own food. And that process is called photoautotrophy. Photo meaning light, autotrophy meaning you make your own sugars. The type of relationship that I study in the deep sea is one where bacteria use chemicals to harness energy from to make their own sugars. Because in the deep sea, there's no light. So this fundamental way of survival in the deep sea is very different than on land because of this absence of light. And going back to our example on land, so plants and other organisms that can do this photoautotrophy create this foundational structure for the entire ecosystem. So you might have like a bunny or, an herbivore, something that eats plants that would eat these, plants and shrubs. And then you would have another organism that might eat the bunny and so forth and so forth. So it's how energy is distributed between all these different organisms, and it supports this whole ecosystem. So all of that depends on the plants and these photoautotrophs. But in the deep sea, what's so important is that there is no light. So the whole ecosystem is dependent on pretty much this process of chemoautotrophy. And chemoautotrophy, its significance is crazy because we didn't even know it existed until the 80s. So it's very recent in terms of discovery. But when we discovered that it was a thing in the deep sea, we found it was relevant everywhere on land. So it's on land, it's on surface water oceans. So it's a predominant system that we don't really know much about. So that is really important so we can try and understand the ecosystem as a whole, right? We live in this world and we don't even know everything about it. So, especially in terms of contexts like climate change, where certain environmental factors are changing, we just have no idea how it's truly going to change if we don't even know how the system works in the first place. So, I hope that through this work of, chemoautotrophy, symbiotic relationship research that I'm interested in, it will help our understanding of the broader ecosystem in the deep sea and thus the Earth.
That's really interesting. I have so many questions within that beautiful explanation you gave. About first, let me ask this. So, what do we already know about chemoautotrophy? Is there anything that might be interesting and beneficial to the audience from the existing knowledge?
So chemoautotrophy is, I like to think of it as a type of metabolism, right? So these bacteria are performing this process and delegating certain proteins to do this task, right? But an aspect of chemoautotrophy is you're in an environment where there's a lot of chemicals. And what are some of those chemicals? One of them is hydrogen sulfide. And if you don't know anything about hydrogen sulfide, it can be very, very toxic to anything that breathes oxygen. But in the deep sea, there are worms, there are clams, there are crabs that need to breathe oxygen. It's in low concentrations down there, but it's still there. So with these organisms that need to breathe oxygen, but also have these bacteria that live within them, that need access to the toxic hydrogen sulfide in the seawater outside, how is this organism going to be able to deliver its own needs and the bacteria's needs if this hydrogen sulfide is so toxic? So there's this deep sea tube worm that I'm thinking of that has developed a really cool hemoglobin that can actually bind oxygen and hydrogen sulfide selectively. And in doing so, avoids this toxicity that could happen for the worm itself and is able to deliver this toxic hydrogen sulfide to the bacteria within them. And that is super interesting. So the fact that these organisms are living in these dynamic and, to us, extreme environments is really insightful for how life can exist under these parameters and maybe eventually how it could help us.
What drew you to doing research in this specific area? What made you curious about the mysteries of the deep sea?
So I actually, before my PhD, did not have any experience with deep sea research at all. I was interested in marine biology my whole life. So I always tried to do research in that realm. But I ended up in the deep sea area because I met my advisor when I was an undergrad. And he was just so amazing as a speaker, as a person, and I was drawn to him. And through further communications with him, and he was gracious enough to talk with me, even as a busy PI, we discovered that we'd probably be a good fit together because we both like symbiotic relationships as a whole. We like ocean sciences, and he just happened to ask these questions in the deep sea, where, in my opinion, it's very exciting because we don't know very much. So I sort of landed into the deep sea realm. It was never really my intention moving forward, but I'm very happy with where I'm at now. So it all worked out.
Oh, wonderful. What drew you to marine biology before you started the PhD?
So I think it was maybe two aspects. So I grew up in landlocked Colorado and moved to landlocked New York. So I was never actually around the ocean that much growing up. But when I would go, just to see like a starfish on the sand was crazy to me. Like, this is an organism that looks so different from everything else you see on land, and it survives in a different way. And it's in this ocean that we can barely access. So when I started to learn more about the ocean, this fascination turned into curiosity and intellectual stimulation. And coupling that to my very adventurous side, I just have this adventurous streak as a person. I realized that ocean sciences was fulfilling for me in that regard. So I was interested in marine biology from a young age, always. How I got into more of the microbial side is unique, I would say. My grandmother, she passed away when I was quite young, and she passed away from cancer. And at the time, I was too young to really understand what cancer was. So I instead kind of looked at these papers about like, what is cancer and what causes it? And a few of them said that there are these things called bacteria that might be responsible for cancer. And I said, wow, like there is something so tiny that can be responsible for such a big effect. That's really interesting. So I had these parallel interests of marine science and microbial science. And then it wasn't really until my PhD where I got to merge them all into one. one and do this big overview of deep sea symbiotic relationships and things like that.
Tell us a little bit about your previous experience in the field. Did you do a master's? How did you get here?
So I do have a master's, but it's a master's in passing, which is an option that my PhD program provided. So I don't have an additional master's outside of my PhD. From undergrad, I went directly, more or less, to my PhD program, but I had a plethora of research experience. I guess going a little bit farther back, even in high school, I didn't really have access to research experience opportunities as a high school student. But I knew it was important at that time to try and make a connection to the ocean and at least the ecosystem and biology and try to figure out if this is really what I wanted to do. So I organized a lot of volunteer workshops looking at the watershed of our local ecosystem and just tried to stay connected to science. And then it really wasn't until undergrad where I had research experience opportunities that I got to learn a little bit more about what it means to be a biologist who studies marine science. So my major was biology and I concentrated in marine science. So I sort of went the pre-med route, but did a little marine science on the side, is how I describe it. So I did have research experience in the medical field a little bit, like I'd done some CRISPR-Cas9 editing and things like that. But my later years in undergrad is really where I gained a lot of research experience, both at my undergrad institution of Cornell and outside at summer internship programs. And that just helped me realize what it means to do research, what it means to be in the lab, and made me realize that I do want to continue my own independent projects and pursue a PhD.
During your experience in research in undergrad and during summer internships and things like that, did you get to publish any research papers? Because people wonder what that previous experience before the PhD really entailed. So tell us a little bit about whether you had publications or any sort of involvement in publications at all.
So I did have one publication prior to starting my PhD, and that came out of a summer internship I had with National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration and the United States Geological Survey. Otherwise, I didn't have publications, really. I was acknowledged in one paper, if they even look at that. But no, I just had this one publication where I was first author on this publication, however. Would I say it made a big impact? It's debatable. I think it wouldn't have hurt. It doesn't hurt me, certainly. But I think the research experience is more important than the publications per se prior to PhD. Because I think a lot of PIs understand that there may not be as much opportunity to publish as an undergraduate student.
Let's talk a little bit about the process of applying to your program. What was the application process to your program at Harvard?
So I actually applied twice to my program. The first time I applied was in, I guess, 2020, so pandemic era. And I guess before I say anything, I'll preface with, if you're considering applying, just always double check the requirements of that specific institution, even if you're applying to Harvard in this exact same program, because they tend to vary and change a lot from year to year. So when I applied, it was like a general statement of purpose. Why do you want to be here? You had to fill out the application portal, which I believed asked one or two specific questions tailored to the research that you're interested in doing. You also were required to submit a personal statement, like what research meant to you and who you are as an individual. 3 letters of rec were required as well. The GRE was optional at the time. It is no longer accepted actually in my program, which is an interesting development. So I did not submit my GRE at the time, and a CV, I guess. Yeah, those are the big kind of overview.
What about funding? We know some PhD programs are funded completely for several years, some are partially funded. What was the situation like for you at Harvard?
Yeah, I'm very grateful because my program will fund me for 6 years, and that counts for all 12 months out of the year. I know some programs do not do that. So I'm very grateful in that sense. The funding is strong. To receive those 6 years of funding, there is a heavy teaching requirement that needs to be completed. I think ours is six semesters of teaching to fulfill that financial requirement. But in our department, you can fulfill this teaching requirement financially in other ways. So if you bring in like an NSF GRFP, for example, you would be able to get out of some of that teaching and supplement yourself. But in terms of funding, it's very generous in my program, and the department will fund me for my time. I know at some other institution, it's the lab directly. But yeah, I would say that is primarily the way that I'm funded. My advisor can chip in here and there, but obviously that depends on a lot of, is your advisor well funded? What grants do they have going on right now? So that's very variable, but mainly it is through my department.
You mentioned there's a big chunk of teaching. Is that as a teaching assistant, or are you taking the role of a lecturer or an assistant professor?
So Harvard calls them teaching fellows, but they are teaching assistants, more or less. There are opportunities if you are someone interested and really enjoys teaching to pursue maybe more of like a preceptor role or a head TA or TF role, but in general, they're fulfilled through basic teaching assistant, teaching fellow requirements.
You mentioned that when you were talking about funding, that you have about 6 years funded in your program. Now, does that mean that the average length of the program is about 6 years, or do people finish early and the remaining funding is available if it's needed?
Yeah, 6 years is kind of on average. There are some people that will stay longer than that. It all really comes down to the nature of your work. So if you are somebody in, bioinformatics, you can probably get your results quickly versus somebody that's doing a lot of field work or a lot of bench work and results may not work out for whatever reason. So a lot of that time is actually due to the nature of your work in our program, not necessarily other factors. So if you graduate early, that's great. You're still funded throughout your 4 to 5 years in the program, but they will fund you up to 6 years. And after that, if you were to stay a 7th year or an 8th year and really try to finish up at that point, you would need to secure outside funding to do that. But in our department, the advisors are very helpful in that regard. They will try to assist you in securing that outside funding for those additional years if you do need it.
So now tell us a little bit about the structure of your program. What goes on in the first year? You're in your second year, correct?
Third.
Right, third year. Yeah, it's a new year, and we've been talking since last year. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what goes on in the first year and up until the defense and the last stages of the PhD.
Yeah, so again, like PhDs are so variable in this way because the structure of my program is so different than, the other biology department at Harvard, which is MCO, and molecular cell and organelles. I think that's it. They're very structured in their PhD program, but us a little bit less so. So there's, about on average, it's about 6 years the program. In the first 2 years, you want to get your course requirements out of the way, and it is required for you to take 6 courses. How do you choose what those are? For the most part, you can choose, but sometimes coming from undergrad, a group of faculty members will look at your transcript and assess if you have gaps in your knowledge. And if so, they will prescribe you a course, and that's called a prescription course. So sometimes that is a requirement you need to fulfill as well. So the first 2 years are roughly courses. Then during your second year or early third, it's expected that you take this exam we call the qualifying exam. I know it goes by other terms, which is a very comprehensive oral exam in our case to assess your readiness for a dissertation candidacy. And what that means is this group of experts in your field are trying to assess if you have the knowledge, do you have the skills as an independent researcher? Are they feasible, these projects that you're coming up with? Can you actually get them done in this time frame? Are we the best people to help you with this? That's the role of the qualifying exam in our department. And once you pass that, then the structure is very loose and you have, 3 years to come up with data, publish, papers, and then defend your proposal, and then eventually graduate. So the actual benchmarks for making progress in our program are very small. It's just the defense and the qualifying exam, really. Otherwise, it's very free. And there's pros and cons to that. So
Thank you, Brooke, for talking a little bit about the structure of the program and the process of applying to your specific program at Harvard University. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about some of the difficulties you've encountered since you first considered pursuing a PhD. Tell us a little bit about what's been going on behind the scenes.
yeah, wow, a PhD is like a black box in and of itself. Like, what is a PhD, which is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, and how do you apply to PhD? They're both black boxes, and it's not as clear cut as, applying to undergrad, where there's a clear outline. There's a lot of resources to understand what going to undergraduate school means and what the process to apply is. So I think when I started PhD, I was falsely under this assumption that there would kind of be a little more structure or clarity in terms of what the expectations were. But there wasn't. It was, I was an independent researcher for truly the first time. And to internalize what that meant was a bit challenging. I think I probably struggled the most with understanding what the expectations of me were from my advisor, from my department, and what my, expectations of my advisor are, truthfully, too. So that was a big challenge because, I always felt like, am I making enough progress right now? I'm learning a lot, but am I making progress? Am I doing what my advisor wants me to do? Is this a good use of my time? Like, does the department know that I'm progressing, even though I haven't finished X, Y, and Z course yet? All of those things were kind of adding a lot of stress. And the clearest way to go about fixing that is just to ask. And luckily, my advisor is someone who I've been able to communicate well with and who can articulate those expectations well. I know that's not the case for every program. But for me, I just said, hey, look, I've realized that I struggle with understanding what your expectations of me are in this program. Can we talk about that? And we did. And it was very helpful for me to understand, which directions I need to move forward for in my research and how I use my time. So yeah, I think it's a topic that not enough people talk about expectations. And it's hard to define them because it depends on every single lab and every single program. But I would say that was what I struggled with a lot in the beginning.
Absolutely. As you were talking, my mind was going back to my early days in the PhD. This first year specifically, I remember coming across those challenges, similar challenges of not knowing what the expectations were and sitting in my chair and wondering, which was not productive at all. The easiest and the most productive thing for me was going to the direct source, which is the supervisor, and having that discussion with him and clarifying what the expectations are and the timeline as well. I wanted to ask you a little bit about a different type of challenges that people come across. What are some obstacles that you come across associated with pursuing a PhD in the specific country you're doing a PhD in, which is the States? Let's narrow it down a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges that you've seen in your institution at Harvard, in your department, that you believe should be addressed in order to make the lives of PhD students easier.
Well, I think there is this underlying tension for all PhD students universally across the globe, which is, what am I going to do after my program? I know the traditional route is academia, right? But, I'm sure as many of us know, that is often not feasible because there's just a limited number of positions. Financially, it can be challenging to pursue that route. So I think as a whole, what I would love to see being done about this is just more job opportunities for people that are so qualified, especially in our current era where we're seeing this kind of exodus of people leaving academia and going into industry jobs because of the tough competition for these academic positions and what it means to sacrifice your own kind of well-being for that process. And I think that is an unfortunate reality of what's going on right now because of the lack of jobs in academia. And academia really is a luxury to be able to think that creatively and pursue your academic interests. But unfortunately, it's not the reality. So what I would really love for, I guess, any institution would just be a stronger emphasis on other career alternatives besides academia, because that's not the reality that we're in right now. And I think that would really alleviate some of the stress, especially if you're, in a PhD, you're kind of narrowed in, you're focused on trying to get your data, you're focused on trying to graduate, and then all of a sudden you have to figure out what's next. So I think if there were more kind of examples and opportunities to understand what you can do outside of academia earlier on in your PhD, it would alleviate a lot of that stress moving forward. And it might help people find better career alternatives than academia. So I wish more opportunities or those pipelines existed universally, but especially at Harvard, where we're very grateful to be at Harvard and the resources that we have, but there is this sort of prestige of we're at Harvard and we're in academia at Harvard. So the career goal is academia, but that's just not the reality. So,
Oh, definitely. Even providing directions to existing opportunities would be helpful. After having finished a PhD, figuring out whether to pursue a career in academia or outside of academia, it's an entirely different project, almost like a project in itself. Some people do it after they've finished their PhD, some people do it during the last year of their PhD, which can be stressful. But either way, I think having more support and direction as to how to pursue those positions that you're interested in from an academic institution, the institution you're doing the PhD in, I think would be extremely helpful and would take a little bit of that stress off of the people who are really trying to secure something after having done a PhD. Now, tell me a little bit about your positive experiences during your PhD. What keeps you going? What keeps you excited in this journey?
When I reflect, there's actually a lot of positive experiences. And I think that comes down to my advisor and the relationship that I have with him and the community that he's built in our lab. It's really positive and great. And I know that's not the experience of many, but I am grateful to be a part of all of that. So a lot of my positive experiences are just talking to my lab members about, a topic in research and talking to a like-minded and also intellectually curious person is such a benefit of being in these intellectual bubbles of like PhD and even in undergrad to an extent too. So I'm really grateful for those just little moments of intellectual conversation. But I also love the community at large and being introduced to people outside of my field. And I think that is a unique attribute of my department specifically. I mentioned before, we're the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, and what an umbrella term that is really different than other departments like our neighbor, which is MCO, molecular cells and organelles, I believe. And they're focused really on the cellular biology and studying this in certain model organisms and what that entails. Our culture and our department is extremely diverse. I mean, we have people studying vascular tissue in plants down the hall from a perspective of physics. And we have people that study fruit fly ovary egg development downstairs. And because of all of this, we have this really diverse intellectually and personally, just this group of people that can contribute and enhance your experience there. So I love tapping into that potential when I'm doing my research and walking around the campus. So I think that's such a positive of my PhD program. And one of the reasons why I selected this program over a few others is this intellectual diversity of people that are just in the same department.
Can you talk a little bit about existing gaps in your research area? So, for example, if a future PhD student wants to focus on the same kind of research that you're doing, what are some unknowns that they could perhaps explore? Given that you're doing research on what's going on in the deep sea, I'm sure there's a lot that we don't know, a lot of gaps, a lot of unknowns. But if you were to highlight one or two, what would be some gaps people could explore in the future?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, there's a lot. And a lot of that has to do with access to the deep sea. Now we're getting access to these remote areas and we can start learning about the biology and the geology of what's going on here finally. But I would say the biggest limitation we have in just deep ocean science as a whole is the limitation of the tools that we have. So, for example, I do a decent amount of transcriptomic and sequencing work. And what that entails is because we don't know enough about, the evolutionary relationships of these proteins and how distantly related they are in deep sea relatives and what even a deep sea genome looks like. I'm very limited in the conclusions that I can make from this data. So a lot of my work is just saying, okay, well, here's what the metabolic state is of this clam in the deep sea because we didn't know that. And now I'm going to answer the questions that I came here to answer. So there's this constant rate limiting step of what tools are available. So I would say if you are interested in bioinformatics, coding, sequencing, there are a lot of opportunities for you in deep sea areas of research. In addition, the biggest limitation as a microbiologist is we cannot culture these bacteria. And that means keep them separate from their host organism in the lab and grow them up on petri dishes. So if someone could figure that out, that would be great. It would probably take maybe 3 or 4 PhDs, but it is such a big limitation in our field. So those two tools are probably the big research gaps, I would say, because we just can't answer questions without these tools. So once that becomes available, research gaps are, all over the place. What is the metabolism of these animals in the deep sea? How are they interacting? Where are they getting their food sources? What is the geochemistry in the deep sea? Does that fluctuate over time? There are just so many research gaps. Yeah, so I would say it's a kind of accumulation of tools and also ability to ask those questions.
That is so exciting. So much yet to be explored and to be studied. That takes me to my next question. How much support do you have, not just you, but researchers who are doing research on what is going on in the deep ocean? I ask this because my research, for example, which focuses on older adults and aging populations, involves issues that are currently ongoing in the society, issues that are related to healthcare systems, long-term care, issues within those institutions and how that affects the society and vice versa. It's understood that it is urgent and it needs to be solved immediately as we have aging populations in almost all countries. Now, because the need is obvious or urgent, the support is there. I'm not saying there's enough support, but it's there. You can convince people to support you financially or with equipment or whatever's needed to pursue that research. Do you have that same level of support for research that is focusing on what's going on in the deep sea? If you don't, what would you like to highlight as some of the needs that researchers in your field would benefit from?
Yeah, I think the deep sea is a very interesting intersection of what you just talked about because it's so out of sight, out of mind, compared to medicine, right? So there is this urgency of we want to do medical research to help people, and that is very important and should be done. Deep sea's out of sight, out of mind. But another area of research that's out of sight, out of mind is astronomy. And it's interesting though, because NASA is decently funded and there are expeditions to go look for, life on other planets and understand our solar system. So you have to ask the question of why, if it's also out of sight, out of mind, why is it also being funded in this way? And I personally think it's because it's out of sight, out of mind, but we can still see the night sky, right? People still look up and wonder. And, the stars have been studied for a long time. The deep sea doesn't have any of this. We didn't have access to it. We didn't know how deep the sea was. We didn't even know that there was really life on the deep sea floor until recently. So it's really time that's been our biggest delay so far. So I think now moving forward, what would be the most helpful thing for researchers in the deep sea? Probably be just access, because still getting to the deep sea is very tricky and it's very challenging. And it requires so much planning and so much logistical components to it. So Harvard does not own a research vessel. right now. I don't know if that will change, but we don't have like an oceanographic institute like Scripps or Woods Hole does. Both of those institutions do have research vessels, and we as independent researchers will contract a day or two or weeks or months on their vessels when they go out and do research expeditions. Or we will maybe write a grant and we will say we want time on this boat to do this work. But all of that takes just so much time. So if there's any way to just increase the number of research vessels or increase policies that would make it more effective to utilize these resources, that would be tremendously helpful. So when we go on a research expedition, we need to plan at least a year in advance. And even that is really tricky because of all the equipment we have to bring. And it just takes up a lot of our mental load and a lot of our energy to plan for these ginormous expeditions. So if there was maybe just some way to, I don't know, mitigate that mental load or just create policies, like I said before, to make this utilization of resources more effective, that would be tremendously helpful.
I have heard this phrase where people say, leave the deep sea alone. Sometimes people think that investigations that go into understanding what's going on deep in the ocean is driven by just curiosity. But it is more than curiosity, as you talked about earlier. Understanding the mechanisms taking place deep in the ocean between the bacteria and it's the chemicals and so on, they have a direct or an indirect impact on human lives. Can you talk a little bit about examples of how the deep sea and what is going on in there can have a direct or indirect impact on human lives?
Yes. So I mentioned this a bit briefly before, just kind of how organisms from a biological perspective, how they have developed under these extreme conditions, right? Extreme to you and I, would benefit us directly because if we were exposed to, a low oxygen condition or, a low temperature condition, we'd be able to understand and possibly mitigate the effects we would receive by understanding the biology of these organisms. So that's a very direct comparison. What some might argue is a bit more indirect, but I would argue is more direct, is actually nutrient availability. So all organisms on life need key nutrients: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, oxygen. Those are the big ones. But it's not just the nutrients we need them in the right form to assimilate them into our tissues, to utilize them the way that we normally do, the way that we're designed to do, quite frankly. And how you access those nutrients depends a lot on the environment that you're in. So for example, like nitrogen is a really key element. It's in a lot of our proteins and it serves very fundamental roles for keeping us healthy. You can't just breathe in nitrogen gas and get nitrogen into your tissues. That's not how we as humans operate. But there are bacteria that do that can actually mitigate and transform nitrogen gas into the right compounds that you need so that then you can work with that compound of nitrogen and move it into your tissues. So this whole cycling and this transformation of compounds into the right form, super critical for all life, period. And just for even geology and chemistry and just how the world works. And if we look at the ocean, just from a surface area perspective, it's 70% of the Earth. And if we think about where a lot of these biochemical transformation of nutrients occur, there's a lot of it being done in the sediments. And the sediments constitute most of the deep sea. So understanding the sediment chemistry and how the bacteria in there are changing their local environments, changing their, ocean environments, and then changing the global environment is actually directly impacting how you and I are able to live today. This is a statistic I'm sure many of you have heard, but everyone attributes, oxygen creation of plants. That's actually not true. It's 50%. So one breath that you take will be from plants. The other one that you take will be from tiny bacteria in the ocean. That is how impactful something so far away can be. And if you think that's impactful with oxygen, what is it doing with nitrogen? What is it doing with sulfur and phosphorus, which are other key compounds? So I would say those are probably two more direct comparisons I can make.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to hear because we don't always hear on a day-to-day basis how something that's so out of sight deep in the ocean can directly or indirectly have an impact on our lives out here. So thank you so much for sharing that, Brooke. Now, I have a few most frequently asked questions. The first one is, how do you maintain a balance as a PhD student? Tell us how you do it.
This is a topic that gets a lot of interest for sure. But I think to talk about it, we should define what a balance is. So a lot of people think, okay, work-life balance. I will work a 9 to 5 and then 5 to 9, I will do my personal thing. And that's my work-life balance. And that's great if it works for you and if it works for the nature of your work. But if you're working with animals or you're doing an experiment that needs you to be physically present for longer than the 9 to 5, you're not going to be able to maintain that structural balance. So in those cases, I think it's important to recognize what does your work demand of you? And how can you offset that by investing in yourself equally? So for example, if you need to be in lab over the weekend, and you're in there 24 hours a day in the lab, just keeping things running, maybe you can take the next 2 days off or something like that. So it's not that strict 9 to 5 structure, but it is still balanced because you're inputting equal amounts of yourself into work and personal. So for me, that changes every day. I walk into the lab and I do something new every single day. So I have to constantly be assessing what that work-life balance looks like for me. And oftentimes that 9 to 5 structure does not work, especially if we're working with live animals. They require more care. So how I maintain that is I have a few kind of non-negotiables for me. That would be, my mornings. I really like to keep my mornings to myself. My 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. is sort of for me. I work out, I read, I do, laundry. I just kind of maintain my personal stuff. And then the later half of the day is for work. So while I don't necessarily always end at 5, or 6, it's still this balance for me because it's what works for me. I've invested in myself and I've invested in my work for the day. But that changes a lot, especially with field work, where I am on for months at a time, living on a research vessel. And that takes a lot out of you. So sometimes I will take a few weeks off after I come back from a research cruise if I can, because I'm just so exhausted from that month away. So I think you have to find what is the balance you need, what is your work requiring from you, what do you value in your personal life, and what does that look for you? So it's taken me probably 3 years to figure out what balance works well for me. So I would just urge anyone watching to reflect on what that balance means to you, what's important to you, and what your work demands.
100%. Identifying what works for you is probably the most important thing in striking a balance, not just for PhD students, but for everyone else in whatever career that you're in. The next most frequently asked question is, what is one PhD myth that you would like to debunk today?
Oh boy, there are a lot, but I think the one that resonates more with me would be that your PhD has to be your identity. So I think when maybe some people think about a PhD student, they might think of, a genius man, who's loved science all his life and has 20 publications and was in science and all the high publishing journals and is just a scientist. And that's what this person is. But I would urge everyone to realize that that is absolutely not the case. Not only do you not have to be a genius to be in a PhD, you can present in any way, shape, and form and be successful. So I think personally, when I started a PhD, what was challenging was I am a scientist. I like science, but I'm also, maybe I would consider myself a more feminine presenting woman in STEM. Like I like to dress up. I like nice outfits. I love jewelry and makeup and all of those things. And sometimes that is, doesn't feel like I'm being accepted for that. And I should be fitting this mold of like what a woman in STEM looks like, which may not be those qualities. But I would urge you, that your identity is this complex being. You can be more than one thing. It doesn't have to be all academic. Like for me, I am a scientist, but I'm also, a feminine woman. And I'm also, a sister and a daughter. And I have those responsibilities. And I have this complex relationship with who I am. And I think there's actually strength in that because I've seen a lot of my peers who do fall into this crux of their identity society becomes their science struggle when the science doesn't pan out because it feels like a reflection of yourself, but that's not true. That's just the nature of science. And a lot of the times it doesn't work. So I think having, this realization, this self-awareness that you are more than your work is really important for surviving, quite frankly, the PhD process.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. Truthfully, I think it is time that we make this change of having to fit into this idea of who a scientist is. Like you said, you like dressing up, jewelry, and all that. I was kind of the same. And I actually went through this process of trying to change myself to fit in. And then I said, doesn't quite feel right. So I had different pivots. You can be yourself and authentic and focus on your work and succeed in that. In the same way, those who fit into the idea of this researcher or a scientist do. I don't think how you dress, well, I mean, as long as you dress appropriately to the environment, I don't think that should or could affect your work or the quality of the work. So thank you for highlighting that. I hear this all the time, and we need to do something about it, either through talking about it and making people aware of it, or actually making that change in the institutions that we work in and the environments we work in. I think it's high time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's just interesting to me because, people who are more authentic to themselves will be more diverse inherently, right? And if we think about an ecosystem, me being my biologist self, right? The strongest ecosystems that are resilient to change are the most diverse ones. So why wouldn't you want to echo that same environment in this academic institution where we're trying to progress ourselves, our society, and how we live? So yeah, I think it's high time too.
Yeah, and I hope people who are watching will be encouraged and brave enough to make that change in their workplaces and environment. It doesn't harm our work, it doesn't hurt anyone, so why not? In fact, I think not doing so will hurt people's personalities and mental health and also their work. So thank you so much for highlighting that. I really appreciate it. We're getting to the end of the interview. What is one advice you would give to future and current PhD students?
So to current PhD students, hang in there. PhD is just not a linear trajectory. It's so different than undergrad, as I'm sure you're already experiencing. So just, go with the ups and downs, experience what you need to, but recognize that you are valuable, your research is valuable, and that there is an end in sight. So just keep all of that in mind as you continue to push forward amazing science. And to future PhD students, the best advice I would have is to be very thorough about researching the lab you want to go into before you go. I did that before applying. And as I mentioned briefly before, I actually applied to my current program twice. The first time I didn't get in, but I got accepted to a different PhD program. And I actually turned that other one down because I realized through, interactions I had with the graduate students there, the advisor themselves, and just some of the community that it wasn't the right program for me. So I think that was probably the best choice that I've made so far. In my career trajectory, because now I'm in this place where I love it and I know I'm a good fit here. I know I communicate well with my advisor and I love the community. I love the support, the location, everything about where I am is just well aligned for what I'm looking for. But I didn't just randomly apply. I really did do the due diligence of looking into the lab, talking to the graduate students, talking to the broader community. What is this experience like? I actually did have a chance to visit the lab before I joined, which was very helpful. And if you have an opportunity to do that, I would highly encourage that because it's a great way to sense community and what the lab is all about. So I really highly cannot stress this enough, really look into the advisor and the lab before you decide to join the program.
I think that is great advice. Talking to other PhD students who are working in that same lab or office can give you a lot of insight into what it would be like for you in your 4 or 5 years or 6 years in your case. That's wonderful advice. I would echo that for sure. Is there anything else you would like to share with the audience before we say goodbye?
I think to sum it up, kind of what a PhD means to me in an effort to help you kind of understand if this is the right path for you. A PhD to me means the freedom and the luxury to think critically and develop those skills and to be creative. And I found a program that aligned with those goals. And that's why I'm so excited to be in this position. So I think if you are feeling similarly, then perhaps, PhD program is for you, or academia and you want to pursue that, then a PhD is for you. But PhD students and their experiences and every institution is just so different. So being very self-aware about why you're doing this PhD, why you want to do it, what does it mean to you, what are you going to get out of it, will just help you be happier in the long run, because it is an investment, especially in the US and some other areas around the world where it's on average 6 years. I know that's not the case everywhere, but it really is like a marathon, not a sprint. So to put in the front work of investing and understanding what that experience would look like for you, what it means to you, is really important for your just overall happiness. So I would urge you to heavily consider that before moving forward with a PhD.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for being here with us today and giving us so much insight into what your journey has been like and sharing with us such interesting ideas and your work in the deep ocean. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure our audience also found it very insightful.
Yeah, thank you so much as well for having me and for having this platform where students like myself can talk about it. I really wish that there was something like this around when I was applying, or I knew about something like this. So thank you so much for doing that and for having me. And thank you everybody for watching. And I hope I gave some helpful advice to some of you out there.
And everyone, thank you so much for being here with us today. It is time to say goodbye for now. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.